This is an audio check from 2141. If there's anybody on the Zoom platform that could hear this, could you please respond for an audio check?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to count down from 5 in order to turn on the live stream. After the countdown, we can begin. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Committee on the Judiciary, Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. I welcome everyone to today's hearing on discrimination and the civil rights of the Muslim, Arab, and South Asian American communities. Before we continue, I'd like to remind members we have established an email address and distribution list dedicated to circulating exhibits or other written materials, motions, or other written matters that members might want to offer as part of our hearing today. If you'd like to submit those materials, please send them to the email address that we previously shared with you, and we will have them distributed. Finally, I'd ask all members and witnesses, both those in person and those appearing remotely, to mute your microphones when you're not speaking. This will help prevent feedback, other technical issues, and possible embarrassments. You may mute yourself anytime you seek recognition. I'll now recognize myself for an opening statement. To my knowledge, today's hearing is the first congressional hearing exclusively focused on the pervasive discrimination facing the Muslim, Arab, and South Asian American communities. It is the first time since 1986 the House Judiciary Committee has had a hearing focused on any component of that community. We did have a hearing earlier this year on Asian hate, and we felt it was very effective. We've had hearings on the ERA, on reparations, other first-time hearings. So the committee's been very active in breaking new ground. The diversity of the Muslim, Arab, and South Asian American communities reflects our history as a nation of immigrants. It includes Americans who have come here from every part of the world. That includes Americans of many faiths, besides Muslims, Christians. They didn't start here either. Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, and Jewish folk. The history of this community is one that also parallels the experience of many traditionally marginalized communities and is deeply rooted in our history. While they are promised individual liberty and guaranteed the opportunity for better life, they are subjected oftentimes to discrimination and stigmatization, both at the hands of sometimes their own government and some number of their own fellow Americans. We've seen what African Americans experienced in this country through Jim Crow years. It's still going on, but there was much discrimination sanctioned by the government with Jim Crow laws. But the history of this community is also of resilience. Their stories are of those families and individuals who have struggled for freedom, safety, economic opportunity, or the right to worship, or all the above, according to the dictates of their own conscience. In that sense, the diverse elements of the Muslim, Arab, and South Asian American communities share in common what Americans all share, the common fundamental belief that if you work hard, contribute to your community, respect the rights of others as you wish your own rights to be respected, and place your faith in our Constitution and democracy, you belong here. Too often people are discriminated against because of acts of other people, and they prejudge people. And that's happened with all minorities that have come to this country. Yet even though they live in accordance, immigrants in this country, with the fundamental beliefs of our society often stigmatizes immigrants. Muslim, Arab, and South Asian American communities who are the subject to this hearing have been subjected to those prejudices and discriminations as well. Somehow they're not American. Well, I'm not sure who is American, except for Geronimo and other Native American Indians. We've seen this stigma reflected in individual acts of discrimination and hate. We see it in the continued workplace discrimination against those who wear religious headgear or facial hair as a sign of their faith. We've also seen it reflected in the current rise of nativism and white supremacy as individuals or places of worship associated with these communities are increasingly the targets of vandalism and violence. These acts of violence, hate, and discrimination are an affront to our shared values and governing principles, and they have no place in our society. In the previous administration, we had a Muslim ban. The first Muslim ban was struck down by the courts as unconstitutional, and it played on prejudices in our community for the benefit of the politicians who proposed it. A second refined Muslim ban was eventually approved by the Supreme Court, but after much harm was done. All of this should be concerning to all Americans because those flawed policies are not only discriminatory, but they also do not make us safer. I hope that we reckon with and reflect on this history today and come together to ensure this discrimination and stigmatization of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian American communities comes to an end. In Memphis, we have a Ramadan dinner, annual dinner with people of all faiths come together. And all they do is get together and talk about commonality of interest and peace and harmony and good deeds and good things. They talk so long that you get really, really hungry. But it's a beautiful experience as everybody comes together and shows that American values are not in any one particular race or religion, but all of us. So I thank our witnesses for appearing here today. I particularly would like to welcome our colleagues, Representatives Carson, Chu, Jayapal, and Omar, and look forward to their testimony and that of all the other witnesses. I'll have to be leaving a bit early because I have a hearing of the Helsinki Commission with concerns with Ukraine. At that time, Ms. Ross will take over as the subcommittee vice chair. She'll take the gavel. I'd like to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Louisiana, my friend, Mr. Johnson, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses and our colleagues and friends for being here this morning. It's obviously a very busy day on the Hill, so we all have a lot going on, so I appreciate your time. This hearing is scheduled to discuss discrimination and the civil rights of the Muslim, Arab, and South Asian American communities, as was said. So let's be clear at the outset, because I think all of us know and agree that discrimination based on race or religion is always wrong, and it's inconsistent with our founding ideals. That's one of the things that makes us American, I would argue. Our nation's promise was boldly asserted in our nation's birth certificate, the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and that we are endowed by our Creator with certain and inalienable rights, all of us. America is not perfect, of course, but it is an exceptional country. We're always growing, we're learning, we're striving to be that more perfect union, as the Constitution articulates. Our federal civil rights laws recognize these facts, thankfully. It took a long time to get there, but they do, and they have for a long, long time. They make clear that disparate treatment of one individual when compared to another cannot be based on race, religion, or national origin, for example. However, some advocates today are pushing for really what amounts to a drastic departure from our traditional notions of racism and discrimination and equality as they've existed in American law for decades and generations. Instead of equality of treatment and equal opportunity, these advocates are pushing for what we now call equity. Rather than non-discrimination, equity requires explicit discrimination to achieve an equitable distribution of outcomes. That is not what has been the tradition here, and it's not what we're based upon. Let me say that again. Rather than non-discrimination, equity often requires explicit discrimination to achieve its ends. Perversely, these ideas have actually caused discrimination against some of the communities that are the subject of today's hearing. At colleges and universities like Harvard, Yale, the University of North Carolina, Asian applicants, for example, face significant hurdles unrelated to academic achievement or merit in the admissions process. Admissions decisions made in the name of equity have also been seen at prestigious high schools across the country and in other institutions. At Thomas Jefferson High School, for example, a magnet school in Northern Virginia, it's considered one of the best public high schools in the country. Admissions policies implemented with the goal of equity had the effect of reducing the number of Asian admittees from roughly 73% to approximately 54%. Just last week, a federal court invalidated the new policy because it failed to treat applicants equally. That's what we're supposed to stand for here. Similar changes and similar legal challenges are playing out right now from New York to San Francisco. As we have this conversation today, I just think we need to remember that equal treatment and equal opportunity are the foundation of civil rights laws. The American dream is not a zero-sum proposition. We need to not hold anyone back so that we ensure that everyone can get ahead. The idea is upward mobility. That's the American dream. We want to broaden the pathway out of poverty for more people. We want to give more opportunity. We all agree, I think, on the end goal. We just have very different ideas on how we're supposed to get there. So I look forward to our hearing from our witnesses today. I also apologize because I got multiple hearings going on at the same time, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Nadler, for his opening statement.
Thank you. I want to begin by informing my friend, Mr. Johnson, that the best public high school in New York, in the country, is Stuyvesant High School in my district in New York. Mr. Chairman, the Muslim, Arab, and South Asian American communities are an essential part of the American fabric. They are our neighbors, friends, and co-workers. Some of our congressional colleagues are members of these communities, and I'm pleased that we will hear testimony from several of them today. According to the Census Bureau, there are over 7 million Arab Americans and South Asian Americans in the United States, including over 750,000 in New York City. We know that the true size of this population is likely even larger because the census underreports these groups. Indeed, as we consider our recent experience with the census, we know that we must make changes to better track the Arab American community. But even without improved census figures, we know from personal experience that from small business owners to healthcare professionals to public servants, the Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities are inextricably woven into the fabric of American society. It is also important to acknowledge that while our hearing focuses on some of the common issues confronting these communities as a whole, there is as much diversity among these groups as there is in the rest of America, and they adhere to a range of faiths, including not only Islam, but also Christianity, Sikhism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Baha'i, and Judaism, among others. A large part of what binds them together, unfortunately, is the shared experience of discrimination targeted at them that stems from the same poisonous tree. Despite their many contributions and long histories in this country, these communities have often been stigmatized as perpetual foreigners, not only by individuals, but often by the policies of their own government. From the nativism confronting those who arrived in the early waves of migration to this country in the late 18th to early 19th century, to those who were scapegoated for the effects of more recent political events like the oil embargo of the 1970s, Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities have faced discrimination rooted in the idea that they are somehow less American than others, despite the fact that their stories are so similar to those of other American families who arrived here as immigrants. And looming especially large over these communities over the past 2 decades are the continuing impacts, both in terms of government policy and interpersonal prejudices, of the September 11th terrorist attacks on the United States. Like all Americans, members of the Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities recoiled in horror at what happened that day, and they shared in the nation's anger and sorrow. Many members of these communities were themselves victims of the attacks. But unlike other communities, many Muslim, Arab, and South Asian Americans endured an unjustified wave of interpersonal discrimination and violence at the hands of their fellow Americans, a societal hatred and cultural stigmatization that continues to impact them to this day, a generation later. Even more concerning, the legacy of 9/11 on national security, counterterrorism, and immigration policies continues to have a disproportionately discriminatory impact on these communities. And as Americans, we should all be concerned when the government creates and implements national security and law enforcement policies based on broad brush assumptions about whole communities of Americans based on their race, religion, ethnicity, or national origin, rather than on an individualized suspicion. Such wholesale discriminatory assumptions are not only unconstitutional, but also un-American to the core, and they do nothing to make us safer. Finally, we cannot hold this hearing today without examining issues of discrimination as part of a broader context of persistent white supremacist violence and extremism in the United States, a trend that has taken on a recent and disturbing revival. The recent rise in hate crimes across the country has had a significant impact on the Muslim, Arab, and South Asian community, just as it has had on other minority communities. From the violence against mosques, to the shooting at the Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, to the vandalization of Hindu temples, hate crimes and hate incidents continue to significantly target these communities. For example, according to the Justice Department's 2020 hate crime statistics, there were 87 anti-Arab offenses, 131 anti-Muslim offenses, 94 anti-Sikh offenses, and 11 anti-Hindu offenses. We also know that all of these statistics are significantly underreported and that they do not include hate incidents that fall short of the legal definition of hate crime. For example, children from these communities are often subject to bullying, a reflection of the interpersonal prejudices they face. The Sikh Coalition has reported that 67% of Sikh kids who have a turban have been bullied. The conversation we are having today is long overdue. It appears that the most recent congressional hearing solely focused on issues impacting any part of the Muslim, Arab, or South Asian American communities was held in 1986 in the Crime Subcommittee. It is long past time to shine a light on the needs of these communities once again. I look forward to hearing from today's excellent panel of witnesses who will provide insight on the current issues impacting these communities and how we can better ensure that they have the protection, justice, equality, and healing that they deserve. I thank Chairman Cohen for holding this important hearing, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Nadler. Mr. Jordan, do you have a statement?
No, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, from our colleagues, so I will yield back. Thank you.
Thank you for your attendance. We welcome our witnesses and thank them for participating in today's hearing. I'll now introduce each of the witnesses, and after each introduction, we'll recognize the witness for his or her oral testimony. Each of your written statements will be introduced in the record in its entirety. I ask you to summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time, for witnesses testifying in person, there's a timing light on your table. All of y'all know what the lights are about. For witnesses testifying remotely, you got to find it on your computer somewhere and some kind of a Zoom view on your screen. Before proceeding with the testimony, I'd like to remind all of our witnesses appearing in both panels that you have a legal obligation to provide truthful testimony and answers to this subcommittee. And any false statement you make today may subject you to prosecution under Section 1001 of Title 18 of the United States Code. Today we have 2 witness panels. In the first panel, we're joined by 4 of our colleagues. Our first colleague is joining us remotely, Representative Andre Carson. Carson represents the 7th Congressional District of Indiana. It encompasses the city of Indianapolis, home of the hottest shrimp cocktail sauce in the world at Elmo's. He's serving in his 7th term in Congress, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you to my good friend, Chairman Cohen. I'd like to thank you and the full committee and my buddy, the professor, Chairman Nadler, for your hard work, as well as the ranking member, and all that you do to protect our Constitution, and especially for organizing today's hearing. You know, Muslims across the country, quite frankly, have asked for this kind of hearing for a very long time. And as the longest serving, currently, Muslim in Congress, it is a tremendous honor to testify today about the persistent discrimination faced by Muslim Americans. I'm particularly pleased to join my buddies, my friends, my congressional colleagues, Representative Judy Chu, Representative Jayapal, and my sister and friend, Representative Omar. You know, as a young Black teenager, a tall Black teenager in Indianapolis, I was targeted, the victim of racial profiling while I was standing outside of a mosque. I was arrested and taken to, put behind bars. There was an outcry from the community who saw the injustice that played out. Unfortunately, you know, the charges were dropped and I was released and became a police officer years later. But it was my Muslim community and friends that stood with us and fought for my release. I learned a very critical lesson that day, that being Black and being Muslim put someone like me under double scrutiny. And you know, sometimes that discrimination and profiling can endanger an individual's safety. On January 6th, a man drove a truck to the Capitol complex. The truck was loaded with an arsenal of explosives and weapons. The truck also contained a list, which included my name and others, because I'm a Muslim member of Congress. You know, the man who wrote up that list has finally pled guilty and will serve time for his crimes when he's sentenced next month by a federal judge. But my experience mirrors so many other Muslim Americans who have been threatened, injured, quite frankly, or killed due to profiling and discrimination. This is a very real threat throughout our daily lives. You know, I really hope today's hearing helps to raise more awareness of the very life-changing impacts of discrimination against Muslims. There's a notion that the Muslim American community is a new one in the US, but the truth is that we've been here long before the Declaration of Independence was signed. Enslaved Muslims were taken from their homes and families in Africa and brought to America as slaves. These Muslims brought their religion with them, and they practice it here in the New World. You know, America's founders had high ideals about liberty and freedom, but they were conflicted too. Many of the founders owned slaves, as we know. If you look very closely at George Washington's plantation home at Mount Vernon, you'll see evidence of the Muslim slaves who worked for the nation's first president. If you look among the crosses, you will see crescents on a number of grave markers. You know, historic Muslim leaders like the great Malcolm X and the great Muhammad Ali are well known, but far too many other trailblazers are less known. But never doubt that Muslims have been an integral part of building this nation. From the very beginning to the present, we're not new here. Our tapestry has only grown richer thanks to the arrival of newer generation of Muslim immigrants who have come to build on our American dream. Some fled persecution and some came for educational and economic opportunities. Muslims have made substantial contributions in every aspect of American life, whether it's the field of medicine or business, law, sports, or entertainment. But unfortunately, the aftermath of 9/11 drastically changed many people's perception of us, and those achievements are not acknowledged as they should be. Regrettably, our own government contributed to the discrimination experienced by Muslims with intensified profiling under the guise of national security. As a former law enforcement officer, someone who's worked in counterintelligence, homeland security in Indiana, I can tell you that most officers strive to carry out their oaths to serve and protect in a very responsible and respectful manner. But 9/11 opened a door to a whole new level of widespread profiling that grew out of fear of the other. Federal agencies like TSA and the FBI started a suspect list and no-fly list, many times just because of the way someone's name sounded or how it was spelled. And once someone's name was on those lists, it could be a nightmare to get them removed. Traveling while Muslim is challenging. Worshiping while Muslim is a challenge too. Law enforcement and intelligence personnel monitor mosques, conducted questionable surveillance of Muslim communities, initiatives that I believe are intended to preserve our national security, like countering violent extremism or CVE, instead have been misused with disproportionate targeting of Muslims. I'm honored that Speaker Pelosi appointed me to be the first Muslim to serve on the House Intel Committee. She did this despite the very racist attacks that a Muslim could or should not be trusted with intelligence data. So I thank you for the opportunity for highlighting this growing community and contributors to our society. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Carson. Excellent testimony. I appreciate it. Our next witness is Representative Judy Chu. Congressman Chu represents the 27th Congressional District of California, has served in Congress since, this says 2009. Did you come in 2009? I thought you were here before I got here. That's okay. Since 2011, she has served as chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. Representative Chu, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Apparently, your microphone may not be on.
Okay. Well, thank you, Chair Nadler, Ranking Member Jordan, Subcommittee Chair Cohen, and other distinguished members of the committee for the opportunity to join my esteemed colleagues in providing testimony on an incredibly important issue: discrimination and civil rights of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities in the United States. I especially want to thank my fellow members on this panel for voicing their personal experiences and uplifting the voices of their communities to the committee today. As chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, or CAPAC, I've spent many years advocating for and defending the civil rights of the entirety of the Asian American and Pacific Islander, or AAPI, community, which includes many of the groups named in this hearing. As we begin today's hearing, we must understand that anti-Asian hate and discrimination, which has been recently thrust into the spotlight, is not a new phenomenon. Whether it's the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, Japanese American incarceration during World War II, or the surveillance of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities after 9/11, our history has shown us what happens when Asian Americans are used as scapegoats in times of crisis. In our more recent history, in the wake of the attacks on our nation on 9/11, the Muslim, Middle Eastern, Arab, Sikh, and South Asian communities became subject to an increasing atmosphere of suspicion, xenophobia, and violence. In fact, just 4 days after 9/11, Balbir Singh Sodhi, a Sikh father, husband, and brother, was shot while planting flowers outside his Arizona gas station, becoming the first victim of a post-9/11 hate crime. Sadly, he would not be the last. Since then, the focus on terrorism from abroad also became a political justification for more prejudice at home. From the passage of the Patriot Act to lies about terrorists at the southern border, prejudice has been used to justify cruel immigration policies, Muslim travel bans, and more in the past few years alone. What's even worse is that this rhetoric has actually inspired new domestic terrorist threats, and innocent lives have been lost as a result. This prejudice took a concrete form in the initial days of the Trump administration when Donald Trump announced his first Muslim ban. What followed were years of pain for families deliberately separated by this ban, forced to miss weddings, funerals, births, graduations, and more. While President Biden rescinded this ban on his first day in office, we must ensure that no president has the power to create a ban like this based solely on religion and xenophobia ever again. I'm proud that the House passed my bill along with Representatives Lofgren, Carson, Omar, Tlaib, and Beyer, the No Ban Act, which repeals all iterations of the Muslim ban and ensures that no future president can unilaterally ban an entire group based on their religion. The Muslim ban wasn't just cruel for its personal impact on families, it was also dangerous in the way it promoted fear of Muslims, which we know leads to more violence. As we have seen with the increase in anti-Asian hate over the past 2 years, with more than 10,000 incidents since March of 2020, creating fear and fostering prejudice against one group can lead to the harassment, suffering, and even death of innocents. That's why I am so proud that the bipartisan Jabara Hire No Hate Act, which I led with Representative Don Beyer and others, was included in the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which was signed into law last May. This law provides local organizations with resources and local law enforcement with the resources and training to improve hate crimes tracking and reporting, something we know is necessary in addressing the sharp rise in hate crimes against all minority communities. Nobody, whether you're Asian, South Asian, Arab, Muslim, Sikh, or any other community, should be targeted simply because of their ethnicity or religion. As chair of CAPAC, I look forward to working with all my colleagues on this panel and so many of the groups represented today to continue the work of combating discrimination against all our communities.
Thank you, Representative Chu. I will now pause for a few minutes as we have technical difficulties, not related to your microphone or your testimony. I think your testimony was, I guess it was heard, was it? It was heard, you were a YouTube star, but not a Zoom participant. So we're trying to synchronize those two groups. So we'll take a brief recess.
What?
This is an audio check from the hearing room, audio check to the platform. If anybody can hear us, could you please respond? This is an audio check from the platform. If anybody on the, well, can you hear this, April? Test, test, 1, 2. All right.
I can hear you on the Zoom.
Audio check 1, 2. Audio check.
Audio check.
Testing, 1, 2,
I can hear
3.
you.
Test, test, 1, 2. Check. Okay.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Testing,
can
1,
hear
2,
you.
3.
Audio check 1, 2. Audio check 1, 2.
I can hear you.
So this is an audio check from witness unit mic 3, witness unit 3.
I can hear you on the Zoom. Can you hear me?
Thank you. Yes, we do.
You're changing out of my.
Audio check from witness mic number 2.
Copy that, we hear you.
Audio check from witness mic number 1.
Copy that, we hear you.
Apparently, technical difficulties have been dispensed with. Our next witness, as we're going in the order of seniority, is Representative Pramila Jayapal. Congressman Jayapal represents the 7th Congressional District of Washington. I believe it's the city of Seattle. A lot of coffee. And a big tower. And boats. And salmon. Currently serving in her third term. She's the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and also chairs the Immigration Task Force of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus and has been a dynamic leader in this particular Congress especially. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cohen, Ann Nadler, Ranking Members Johnson and Jordan, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify at this important hearing with my wonderful colleagues. I sit before you as the first and only South Asian American woman elected to the House of Representatives. 9/11 forever changed what it means to be Muslim, Arab, or South Asian American in America. On September 11th, a friend on the East Coast woke me up at 5 in the morning, calling to ask if I had heard what had happened. I had just moved into a new home. I had to unpack my very tiny television, and I sat amidst boxes, watching in horror as the first images of the Twin Towers played on repeat. And I knew that life would never be the same again for people who look like us sitting at this table. In the days and weeks after, I received fearful calls from individuals in the Sikh, Muslim, and Arab American community who were being attacked for wearing turbans or hijabs. I heard from moms and dads who were afraid to send their kids to school, a fear that I shared for my own child. For the first time since I had come to America at the age of 16, I had to think about whether to wear my Indian clothes outside, and I didn't want to let my child leave the house. When I left home, I literally could feel the tension in my body, like I was being constantly watched, and I worried that I would be attacked or that someone would yell hateful things at me simply for being who I am. Others had it far, far worse. On September 13th, a man armed with a gun and a tank of gasoline went to a mosque in North Seattle, trying to attack people as they left evening prayers and setting a car on fire. A few days later, the first Sikh American, Balbir Singh Sodhi, was murdered in Mesa, Arizona, simply because his attacker thought that he looked like Osama bin Laden and should be held responsible for the attacks. Every single day, I received calls about Muslim women who had been harassed on the streets, women having their hijabs torn off, taxi drivers who were beaten for being Sikh American, Muslim families who withdrew their children from school because they were too afraid to get on the bus or go out in public. And it didn't help when days after the attacks, President George W. Bush proclaimed, "Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists." For many Arab, Muslim, and South Asian communities, this stark language seemed directed at us, and the words cemented division and had an enormous psychological impact on our communities. This us versus them rhetoric sparked terrible policy decisions that continue to impact the civil rights and civil liberties of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities, as well as other communities. Cloaked in national security, the President and Congress advanced policies and laws intentionally designed to criminalize, surveil, police, and deny immigration benefits to these communities. Just 10 days after 9/11, Congress passed the Patriot Act, with little regard for the enormous problems that it created for civil liberties and privacy protections for all Americans, but in particular for those most likely to be targeted. Many provisions which still remain and have been used against Masa communities. There are some beautiful things that come out of crisis as well. I ended up founding a nonprofit civil rights organization named One America to fight the backlash targeting Muslim, Sikh, and South Asian communities, and ended up organizing immigrants across the board for justice for the next decades. In the months and years that followed, we successfully defeated government efforts to deport about 5,000 Somalis from across the country. We fought back against special registration and detention of 1,200 Arab and Muslim men. We defended Muslim and Somali businesses from unjust attempts by the government to put them out of business. We held hearings to tell our stories, including a 2003 Senate hearing held at the request of late Senator Ted Kennedy. I am proud that out of tremendous crisis came courage and resilience of our communities, but I am also aware of how much work there is still to do. I still have constituents who are trying to get their names off discriminatory lists created after 9/11 that have prevented them from getting benefits that they should have. 20 years later, here in Congress, I was proud to introduce a resolution on the anniversary of 9/11 with my colleagues, Representatives Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and Judy Chu. Our resolution, HRES 629, recognizes the climate of hate that Arab, Muslim, Middle Eastern, South Asian, and Sikh communities have experienced since September 11th and calls for action to address the lasting impacts of 9/11. I hope this hearing becomes one step of many to examine and ultimately dismantle 9/11 era policies that have perpetuated and exacerbated discrimination against these communities. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing. I yield back.
Thank you for your testimony and your work on these issues over the years. Our last witness is on our first panel is Representative Ilhan Omar. She represents the 5th Congressional District of Minnesota, also known as the home of Prince. Includes Minneapolis with the Twins and a big mall and surrounding suburbs. She was sworn into office in January 2019, making her the first African refugee to become a member of Congress, the first woman of color to represent the state of Minnesota, and one of the first 2 Muslim American women elected to Congress. Representative Omar, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman, Ranking Member, and distinguished members of this committee. Thank you for holding this very important hearing. I'm no stranger to discrimination, hate speech, or threats of violence against my family and myself simply because of my identity. As a Black, visibly Muslim woman who came to this country as a refugee, I have dealt with racist, xenophobic, bigoted comments and threats all my life. Even being elected to offices hasn't stopped me from being othered. I've received vile remarks from the public as well as members of Congress. Sadly, I am just one of millions of Americans across this country who have experienced discrimination and attacks. In recent years, we've witnessed increased attacks on Asian Americans, immigrant communities, religious minorities in spaces, and that's only a fraction of violence. It is demoralizing to watch acts of such blatant racism and xenophobia all carried out with complete disregard for the humanity of others. Sadly, our government has a history of sanctioning such hatred and violence. In 1798, President John Adams signed into law a set of 4 bills collectively known as the Alien Sedition Act. These 4 bills increased the residency requirement for American citizenship from 5 years to 14 years, authorizing the president to imprison or deport foreign nationals considered dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States and restricting speech critical of the government. These laws were designed to restrict the activities of foreign-born Americans, silence minorities, and weaken freedom of speech and the press. By 1801, 3 of the acts were repealed due to its unconstitutional nature or allowed to expire. However, the Alien Enemies Act remains in effect to this day, even though it is unconstitutional as the other 3. The Alien American Act allows the United States President to determine how and if all foreign nationals should be apprehended, restrained, secured, and removed in the event of a war. There are a number of troubling and scary aspects of this law. First, war is not defined in this act, allowing it to be loosely interpreted. Second, this act completely bypassed the judicial process, ignoring due process and the right of appeal. And lastly, foreign national refers to anyone who's not a U.S. citizen, even if they might be a lawful resident in the United States. Meaning, even if you have lived in the United States legally for 20 years, built a community, started a family, for whatever reason not have gained citizenship, you would be subject to apprehension, detention, or deportation without due process. I introduced the Neighbors Not Enemies Act to repeal this unjust law. And while many might say this 18th century law is outdated and has no impact on modern history, I would like to remind you that less than 100 years ago, the United States invoked this act during World War II to detain and subsequently deport Japanese, German, and Italian immigrants. Just last week, we marked the 80th anniversary of the executive order signed by President Franklin Roosevelt, which led to mass incarceration of nearly 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry. In the years since, the United States has recognized injustices done to the Japanese American and subsequently apologized for the cruel internment. Although we promised to never walk down that dark path again, we failed to keep that promise. During the 2016 election, President Trump used the Alien Enemies Act as a justification for the Muslim ban. Administration after administration have continuously demonstrated the danger of unchecked executive power and stain it has on our countries decades and centuries later. Whether it is justifying putting hundreds of thousands of people in internment camps, attacking Muslim immigrants and refugees, or separating families at the border, the Alien Enemies Act dangerously permits the president extreme executive powers to unjustly target an entire group of foreign nationals. This outdated and xenophobic law is an offense to our nation's values. We must learn from historic mistakes based on fear of the other and embrace a system of freedom and equality by passing the Neighbors Not Enemies Act. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. That completes and concludes our first panel. I thank our 4 colleagues for joining with us and giving us their testimony and their work on these issues, and we hope to be able to come up with some legislation. Thank you. Before we go to the second panel, we will have Ms. Ross will take the chair. I just want to express all of the members of the next panel are equally important and valuable, and all are very much appreciated. But I particularly, I'm going to miss the opportunity to introduce Ms. Zulfat Swara, because she's from Nashville, Tennessee, and that's a city I've spent many years in. It's in my state. It's home of Vanderbilt University, where I went to college, Tennessee State Senate, where I was sentenced to for 24 years before I was allowed out and given a parole here in the Congress. You're very welcome. We look forward to your testimony. Ms. Ross, you're on.
Go. Excuse me? Oh, okay. We'll give them a second to set up the panel. Okay, I'm on page 13. Okay. Okay, welcome everyone. Our first witness on the second panel is Maya Berry. Ms. Berry is the executive director of the Arab American Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan, national civil rights advocacy organization founded to nurture and encourage direct participation in political and civic life to mobilize a strong, educated, and empowered Arab American community. She previously served as the legislative director for House Minority Whip David Bonyer, where she managed the congressman's legislative strategy and developed policies on international relations, human rights, immigration, civil rights and civil liberties, and trade. She also serves as the co-chair of the Hate Crime Task Force at the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights. Ms. Berry, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Good morning, Chairman Cohen, Vice Chair Ross. Better? Thank you.
Is your microphone on?
It says talk,
Perfect.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, Chairman Cohen, Vice Chair Ross, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the committee. You've convened an important hearing today because it is the first congressional hearing to examine the civil rights of communities most directly impacted by post-9/11 national security policies and discrimination. For my community, it comes nearly 36 years after another historic hearing of the House Judiciary Committee in 1986, entitled, quote, "Ethnically Motivated Violence Against Arab Americans." The impetus for the hearing was the surge in violent hate crimes targeting Arab Americans, including the tragic 1985 murder of civil rights advocate Alex Oda. The climate was dangerous enough for FBI Director William Webster to warn that Arab individuals or those supporting of Arab points of view have come within the zone of danger. The importance of a hearing providing congressional oversight for a particular community is clear, but the hearing would also go on to serve as one of the key drivers of the passage of the Hate Crime Statistics Act of 1990. Like 1986, we have the opportunity today to make this hearing a beginning, a first step for much-needed reforms that will protect our Constitution, our civil rights, and our civil liberties, the very charge of this subcommittee. This hearing brings together three individual communities, though some overlap and we have some meaningful shared experiences and a lot of solidarity. Lest we not forget that the first victims of deadly hate crimes post-9/11 were members of the Sikh community. However, the single most unifying factor is that our government has securitized its relationship with all of us. By viewing Arab Americans, American Muslims, and South Asian Americans through a lens of national security, the relationship becomes one of mitigating external threats instead of communities deserving of service and protection as any other group of Americans. And as a securitized community, our fellow Americans have come to view us differently too. Sometimes have even targeted us for discrimination and bias-motivated hate. Nearly 3 years ago, a man was sentenced to 5 years in prison, convicted of a hate crime for threatening the life of AI President James Zogby and our staff. He is the third man to go to jail for threatening us since 9/11. Most do not accept that we got here because of animus towards any of these communities, but rather because we have to keep America safe in what is commonly referred to as, quote, the war on terror. Our civil rights and civil liberties being violated in the name of national security, well, that is often used as a necessary price to pay for public safety. From the Patriot Act and its mass surveillance, to the Discrimination Special Registry Program of Nseers, to rampant profiling, to watch lists of Americans of undetermined size without a redress process, to shockingly ignorant and bigoted FBI training material, to NYPD spying program, to harmful and ineffective countering violent extremism programs, to flying while Arab or Muslim, getting added to the lexicon of driving while black, to denaturalization programs, or finally to the Muslim ban. Our country has put in place practices that have violated fundamental rights and shown a lack of respect for our Constitution. Let's pause for a moment and consider some historical context. In 1980, Congress established a commission to examine the causes and impact of the shameful incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. They found the infamous Executive Order 9066 was not born of military necessity, but rather that, quote, the broad historical causes which shaped those decisions were race prejudice, war hysteria, and the failure of political leadership. 80 years after this astonishing violation of the rights of nearly 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent, it is useful for us to consider those three factors the report emphasized when examining the topic of our hearing today. In the case of Arab Americans, the prejudice is evident in the depiction of my community, from entertainment to news, and the polling we conduct of American attitudes regrettably bears that out. Second, we can easily arrive at war hysteria, quote unquote, through a war on terror that will not end until we defeat terrorism, and as such, can be held as permanent. Finally, we have seen the failure of leadership in at least two different ways. One, when our elected officials who sow fear by failing to speak out against hate and bigotry and instead traffic in it. And two, when our elected officials fail to provide the necessary oversight to prevent government abuses. Over the course of the last 20 years, the federal government's counterterrorism authorities have expanded significantly. My written testimony offers some specific recommendations, but now, 20 years since 9/11, is the right time to revisit so that we can course correct and pass legislation that provides security for all of us without compromising the rights of any of us. The protection of the fundamental rights of securitized communities like Arab Americans are certainly at stake, but so is our ability to protect the constitutional rights of all Americans and to maintain a free society. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Berry. Before we take our next witness, we're going to have another brief technical recess. There's something going on with the witness microphones, and we want everyone to hear you. So just briefly, thank you for your patience.
Audio check from witness unit number 4. Audio check.
Copy that. We hear you on the platform.
Audio check from witness mic number 5. Audio check 1 2 1 2.
We do not hear you. We do not hear you on the platform.
Audio check 1 2 1 2 3. Audio check from witness unit number 4.
We hear you on number 4.
Audio check on witness number 3.
We hear you on number 3.
Audio check witness number 2.
We hear you on number 2.
Audio check on witness number 1.
We hear you on number 1.
Okay, see, that one was quick. You're charmed. Our next witness is Shobha Wadia. She is the Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Samuel Weiss Faculty Scholar, and Clinical Professor of Law at Pennsylvania State University School of Law. Her research focuses on the role of prosecutorial discretion and in immigration law and the intersections of race, national security, and immigration. She teaches courses in immigration and asylum and refugee law. Prior to joining Penn State, Professor Wadia was Deputy Director for Legal Affairs at the National Immigration Forum in Washington, D.C. She received her JD from Georgetown University Law Center, where she served as a senior notes and comments editor of the Georgetown Immigration Law Journal. She received her AB with honors from Indiana University. Professor Wadia, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Cohen, Ranking Member Johnson, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify at today's hearing. Discrimination in immigration law is deeply rooted in our history, as seen with the Chinese Exclusion Act and a national origin quota that effectively blocked immigration from Asia. Only in 1965, during the Civil Rights era, did President Johnson sign a bill amending the immigration statute to end national origin quotas. The 1965 Act altered the racial landscape of the United States and opened doors for families like mine. My parents were raised in India, and after their marriage moved to the United States. My father worked at the Dayton, Ohio VA as a physician from the beginning of the AIDS crisis. My mother entered the United States as the spouse of a green card holder. While the 1965 Act yielded a more facially neutral immigration statute, discrimination in Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities endured. One sharp example is September 11th, 2001. I was working as an immigration attorney in downtown DC, and on my way home soon after, I saw spray painted on a wall, "Deport Arabs." In the post 9/11 era, executive branch agencies used national security as a basis for creating new immigration policies that targeted Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. One significant 9/11 policy change was known as the National Security Entry-Exit Registration System, or Nseers. It was rolled out in waves, first in a speech by the former Attorney General, and later in several publications in the Federal Register. The most controversial piece of Nseers was a call-in policy that drew more than 80,000 men from Muslim-majority countries to local immigration offices for lengthy interrogations, fingerprints, and photographs. I recall vividly standing in front of the local immigration office during Nseers and conducting Know Your Rights sessions about the program inside of mosques. Nseers failed as a national security program because it relied on a premise that singling out Muslim males residing in the United States would somehow improve national security. The residual effects of Nseers were striking. Nearly 14,000 notices to appear or charging documents were issued to those who complied with the program, triggering removal proceedings for the same. Others subject to Nseers were denied green cards years later. Only in December 2016 did DHS issue a final rule ending the regulatory framework of Nseers. But history repeats itself. 7 days after his inauguration, former President Trump signed an executive order which suspended for 90 days the entry of foreign nationals from 7 countries with Muslim populations of over 90%. The executive order was based on Section 212F of the immigration statute, which allows the president to suspend the entry of non-citizens if their entry is detrimental to the interests of the United States. Working with families impacted by the various bans brought me closer to human suffering. Note, it was individuals in a qualifying relationship, like my own parents, who were being turned away because of where they were born. That is why my co-counsel and I argued in an amicus brief to the Supreme Court how the ban ushers our nation into a pre-1965 era. More than 9,000 spouses and minor children of US citizens were impacted, creating one of the greatest untold stories of family separation. More than 50 years after the 1965 Act and 20 years after 9/11, immigration laws continue to target Masa communities, as well as broader communities of color, often because of policy choices made by the executive branch, but also due to congressional inaction. History will continue to repeat itself unless we do something different. And that requires a rejection of categorical exclusions based on national security, a recognition of an already robust statute, and an immigration policy that is guided by principles of family unity, racial equity, and compassion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that testimony, Professor. Our next witness is Zulfat Swara. Ms. Swara is a council member at large of the Metropolitan Government of Nashville and Davidson County, Tennessee, a position she was first elected to in 2019. She is the first Muslim elected to the council, the first Muslim woman elected to office in Tennessee, and the first Nigerian immigrant woman elected to any office in the United States. In addition to serving on the Nashville and Davidson County Council, she is Executive Director of Grants and Contracts at Meharry Medical College. And among many accolades, she was named the 2018 Muslim Policy Advocate of the Year by the Islamic Society of North America and received an award for outstanding service to human rights from the Tennessee Human Rights Commission. Councilmember Swara, you are recognized for 5 minutes, and welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Cohen, Vice Chairman Ross, Chair Nadler, ranking members, and other members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to address you this morning. My name is Zulfat Swara, and I'm a council member at large in Nashville. Prior to my election, I served for 6 years as chair of the American Muslim Advisory Council, AMAC, a statewide organization that works to empower the Muslim community through civic engagement, community building, and media relations. AMAC was formed in 2012 following community mobilization against the anti-Sharia bill and the opposition to the building of the Mosques Mosque. Tennessee is home to large populations of Mexicans, Kurds, Somalis, Arabs, South Asians, and many more. Despite this rich diversity in our state and our country remain heavily polarized. There are increased attacks on Asian Americans, and the demonization of Muslims continues to grow. This hatred is fueled by actions or lack thereof by our federal, state, and local elected officials to protect our rights. It cultivates an environment where my youngest daughter is called a terrorist by a classmate. I'm therefore standing before you as a mother, advocate, an elected official, a Muslim, and above all, an American citizen, to share with you, based on my experiences and interactions, some of the issues facing the Muslim communities. On the federal level, issues such as surveillance and profiling have negatively impacted our community. From New York to California, federal agencies have violated the privacy of Muslims within their places of worship, an injustice that was recently taken up to the U.S. Supreme Court. It also extends to private groups, exemplified by the case in Ohio, where an anti-Muslim aid group recruited a Muslim to spy on his own community. Furthermore, TSA backroom interrogations, no travel, watch lists, and extra searches are just some of the ways this discrimination rears its ugly head while flying. From multiple directions, our community continues to have our liberties unprotected and infringed upon. Singling out marginalized groups such as ours is unjust and is reflective of the discrimination many minority groups face in this country. Unfortunately, our children are not immune to this discrimination. Our girls do not have the same access of rights in playing sports. In September 2020, a Muslim high school student in Tennessee, Najah Akil, was disqualified from a volleyball game because of her hijab. The rule enforced reduced her religious headscarf to a mere device that could only be worn with special permission. Thankfully, due to her courage, all Tennessee athletes and all American high school volleyball players can now compete and have fun like others while wearing religious headdress without prior permission. Najah's victory was for volleyball. There are still other sports in this country where Muslim girls are not able to participate without giving up their religious beliefs. Finally, no single policy impacted us more than the Muslim ban. It was discriminatory, torn family apart, and further otherized American Muslims. Grateful that President Biden lifted the ban, but there are still lasting implications that are yet to be resolved. When it comes to discriminatory policy, things are worse at the state level. What started with Tennessee's anti-Sharia bill in 2011 has progressed to relentless attempts to pass other discriminatory bills to marginalize our communities. Attempts to ban lessons on Islam in school, claims of Islamic indoctrination, no-go zone bill, and more. While most of these bills fail, they continually send the message that our presence and our beliefs are not welcome. Finally, there exists a blatant double standard in the response to acts of domestic terrorism. On Christmas Day 2020, a bomb was detonated in downtown Nashville. It was an event that shook our city, and while I'm grateful to the heroism of our local police officers, it was perplexing that despite being notified the year before about concerns that the perpetrator was building bombs, his residence was never investigated because he was not at home. No law enforcement ever came back to reinvestigate this lead. Had this man been a Muslim, his door would have been kicked down and his community attacked. It is this same double standard that on the national level framed the January 6th act of terror against this very US Capitol as legitimate political discourse. This is my home, my country. I'm vested in it and I've invested in its welfare. But my heart breaks every time there's a discriminatory bill or an action by those in authority. Muslims, Arabs, and South Asian Americans have contributed greatly to this country. We're not asking for preferential treatment. All we ask is to be treated with the same respect and dignity and afforded the same rights as all Americans. I fervently hope that the outcome of this hearing will do just that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Swara, and thank you for your service to your community. Our next witness is Azra Nomani. She is the Vice President for Strategy and Investigations for Parents Defending Education. She is a former Wall Street Journal correspondent and has written for the Washington Post, New York Times, Slate Magazine, and Time Magazine about Islam. She has spoken about women's rights in Islam on CNN, PBS, NPR, and the BBC. She has been an advocate for moderation in Islam. She previously was a professor in the practice of journalism at Georgetown University. Ms. Nomani, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all the distinguished lawmakers that are here today. Just across the Potomac River on Sunday, I stood with a group of parents on a back deck, and we were celebrating our triumph against racism, against systemic racism. But it wasn't against a white supremacist organization that we had won. We had defeated racism by the 12 school board members in Fairfax County Public Schools, all endorsed, alas, by the Democratic Party. My testimony is a warning cry about a new racism that is occurring in the United States today. It is targeting South Asians, Muslims, and Arabs, along with many other people. So many people are now being impacted by a divisive ideology that is in our schools also. It replaces the old hierarchy of human value with a new hierarchy of human value. Neither is acceptable. And federal authorities, state and local authorities are subjecting us to surveillance, harassment, and criminal prosecution when we as parents stand up to this new racism. Born in India and raised in West Virginia, I moved to Northern Virginia in 2008 because I thought that the state had now voted for President Obama and it was now progressive enough for a minority like myself. I moved there as a single mother with my son just 5 years old. And in Virginia, he grew up. In 2017, my son learned that he had gained admission to Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology. It was the realization of the American dream for us. But then, on June 7th, 2020, we received an email from the white principal at the school. And she told us, the mostly Asian, mostly immigrant parents and students at the school, that we needed to check our privileges. She told us that we had to change admission to Thomas Jefferson High School because she wanted a different type of minority. Of course, we want all students to succeed, of course. But all of a sudden, our parents were on the wrong side of brown. And let me share with you some of the names from our student directory. They are names of the types of people that this hearing is concerned about. Last names like Singh, Patel, Abdul, Malik, and then my name, Nomani. What are our privileges? Suparna Datta, a mother, came here with dollars in her pocket to study in Tennessee. Yu Yanzhou, she stood in Tiananmen Square for human rights. And then when she read this email from the principal, she had traumatic flashbacks to that moment when she was a child and her teacher made her stand up and take off the red scarf that she had received as a symbol of her privilege in the Communist Party. School board members, activists, policymakers started calling us slurs like white adjacent, resource hoarders, toxic, racist. I had never before in my decades of life in the United States experienced so much aggression and hostility against us. And in one text, a school board member said, "We know that this policy is anti-Asian, LOL, laughing out loud. We all know in this hearing that racism is not a laughing matter. But guess what? Our brave parents came together and we created an organization called Coalition for TJ. And we went to court with the lawyers of Pacific Legal Foundation who fight for civil rights. And guess what? Just this Friday afternoon, we got an email. We won. We won in protecting our families from the racism that is now being perpetuated in our school system. This is a significant victory. This is huge. This is what is a national security issue today as we compete against China. But how did this happen? How did we go from this ideology of critical race theory that says that we must look at all of society through the lens of race and then become this? How to be an anti-racist, in which this ideologue says that we can only, can you imagine this? Correct past discrimination by present discrimination. What kind of a country is this? That is not the kind of country that my father came to. Critical race theory and education. That's why we have this at TJ. And then they are reaching for our little babies. Woke baby, anti-racist baby. What are these concepts? These are concepts for racism.
Ms. Nomani, your time has expired.
Thank you. We, the families, we are parents, mama bears and papa bears. We do not want to be called domestic terrorists when we are protecting our baby cubs. We must all stand together for our country. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your testimony. The witnesses will be reminded that they need to keep to 5 minutes because we have so many witnesses and we want to get all of you in. So thank you so much for that. And we will now move to Hamid Alam, a staff attorney and program manager for the National Security and Civil Rights at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Asian Law Caucus. Mr. Alam's work at the Asian Law Caucus focuses on protecting communities, and in particular, Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian communities from government surveillance and policing in the name of national security and counterterrorism. His work also includes advocating for an end to surveillance and policing programs that disproportionately and unjustly target communities on the basis of their religion, ethnicity, and national origin. Mr. Alam has a law degree from the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law, and a master's in theological studies from Harvard Divinity School. Mr. Alam, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Cohen, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for convening this important hearing and inviting me to testify today. For decades, the federal government has unjustly and disproportionately subjected MEMSA, Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian communities to persistent profiling, surveillance, and criminalization. These policies have created a climate of fear and distrust within MEMSA communities, and they have inflicted perhaps irreparable damage, compelling these communities to chill their free expression, the languages they speak, the practice of the religious faiths, and so much more. Today, I share some examples of the destructive impacts of federal government policy on MEMSA communities to demonstrate how so-called counterterrorism policies and practices have unjustly marked community members as quote-unquote extremists, terrorists, and national security threats based on nothing more than their religion, ethnicity, race, or national origin. I start with experiences from my own community of Southern California, where I grew up. There, Muslim community members unknowingly welcomed an FBI informant posing as a new convert to Islam. The informant canvassed half a dozen mosques across Southern California under the direction of FBI agents, with the agents instructing him that the goal was to gather as much information on Muslims and only Muslims. As part of the operation, the informant befriended several community members, at times making explicit references to violence in an effort to elicit a similar response, a response he did not receive. Rather, in an ironic turn of events, community leaders reported the informant to the FBI. Their complaints went unanswered, however, because the individual was an informant the FBI themselves had planted into the community. Several years later, community members learned about the FBI's activities in their sacred places of worship. The impact was severe. Congregants became fearful of attending prayer or mosque events. Many were afraid to make new friends or welcome newcomers. Some even questioned their existing friends and wondered if they too were informants. As Imam Yasser Fazaga, an imam of one of the mosques targeted by the informant, has said, not only did the spying break the trust between the community and the FBI, it broke the trust within the community. The impacts of the FBI surveillance in Southern California can still be felt today. I am, however, proud to say that our community did not stay silent. We sued the FBI, and the case FBI v. Fazaga is now before the Supreme Court. The case is an example of the US government's disregard for the civil rights of Muslim communities. It is worth noting that no terrorism-related convictions, let alone arrests, resulted from the FBI's operations in Southern California. The facts seen in that case, however, are part of a broader pattern in history of government surveillance targeting Amemsa communities for decades. Around the same time the FBI informant was operating in Southern California, the FBI was also gathering information on Bay Area Muslims under the ostensibly friendly guise of quote-unquote mosque outreach. Muslim communities granted the FBI access to their communities, believing the FBI when they said they were merely protecting communities at risk of hate crimes. But instead of receiving protection, these communities fell victim to FBI monitoring. Their sermons, conversations in prayer halls, and other First Amendment protected speech were all recorded by the FBI, which marked the records they compiled as positive intelligence. Our communities should not be burdened with the stain of guilt by association. Being Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, or South Asian, among other markers, cannot be the primary indicator of potential criminality. This is unacceptable and unlawful. Policymakers must understand that our communities have been treated as suspects simply for being who they are. While interpersonal acts of violence and the presence and increase in bias-based prejudice, xenophobia, and Islamophobia are important to consider, what is so often missed in these conversations is how the federal government itself has contributed to and exacerbated the very biases that lead to the harms these communities face. So, if we are indeed serious about civil rights, civil liberties, and our Constitution, we must examine more deeply the bias, suspicion, and distrust of Amemsa communities that underlie the so-called national security and counterterrorism infrastructure both here and abroad. A necessary part of that is also examining our government's role in contributing to the culture that justifies it. For the community subjected to such systematic and persistent surveillance and policing, the harms are long-lasting and perhaps irreversible. I know this because I have been and remain a part of the same communities that have been and are still vulnerable to the federal government surveillance operations merely on the basis of our religious identities. I prayed at the very mosques that were at the center of the FBI surveillance in Southern California. My family, my friends, my classmates, all of us have prayed at Imam Fazaga's mosque. We broke bread there, we worshiped there, and celebrated moments of joy and grief there. But after learning that our trust in sacred spaces were violated, our communities and perhaps our nation may never truly be the same. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here and to share these stories with you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Mr. Alam. Our next witness is Devin Westhill. He is the president and general counsel of the Center for Equal Opportunity. Immediately prior to his current role, Mr. Westhill served as the top civil rights official at the United States Department of Agriculture in the administration of President Donald J. Trump. He has also worked at the United States Department of Labor, at the Federalist Society, and as a criminal trial lawyer in private practice. Mr. Westhill earned his BA in philosophy from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, go Heels, and his JD from the University of Florida. Mr. Westhill, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Chairman Nadler, Chairman Cohen, Ranking Member Johnson, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to provide my testimony. I'll begin by commenting on the vicious physical attacks on Asian Americans that have been reported in the media in the last couple of years. I then turn to affirmative discrimination against Asian Americans by educational institutions. I close by appealing to those who desire to address these issues, not to do so in a way that focuses on, quote, equity of outcome at the expense of the principle of equality under law. Christina Yuna Lee. Ms. Lee was an Asian American creative content producer living and working in New York City. In the early morning hours of February 13th, just 2 weeks ago, the 35-year-old was stalked and stabbed to death in her apartment building. Michelle Alyssa Go. Ms. Go was an Asian American professional services manager and advocate for those experiencing homelessness. On the morning of January 15th of this year, the 40-year-old was murdered when she was shoved from a subway platform into an oncoming train. Yao Pan Ma. Last year, Mr. Ma, an Asian immigrant chef experiencing financial hardship during the throes of the COVID-19 pandemic, was brutally beaten, his face and head stomped. Mr. Ma later died of the bleeding this attack caused in his brain. I could go on. These attacks did not discriminate against Asians of any particular ethnicity or hailing from any particular geographic region of the world. It is no surprise to learn then, as a recent Pew Research Center poll revealed, that 32% of Asian American adults fear being threatened or attacked, a proportion of respondents that surpassed any similar concern by other racial or ethnic groups. Because as a result of their ethnicity, Asian Americans may be at a heightened risk to become victims of violent crime, lawmakers and others must establish and maintain a hard line against all crime. A failure to prioritize and fund effective policing and to state publicly and often that crime will be punished swiftly and severely will only lead to more tragedies like the ones I've stated. The organization that I head, the Center for Equal Opportunity, has participated as amicus curiae in numerous Supreme Court cases regarding disparate treatment on the basis of race or ethnicity, including now in the case of Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard, consolidated with a case challenging a similar racial preferences scheme at the University of North Carolina. In reviewing the evidence in these cases, one is struck by how clearly and shamelessly both schools discriminate in their admissions based on the race or ethnicity of the applicant, particularly against highly qualified Asian Americans. The evidence presented in the Harvard case indicates that extraordinarily well-qualified Asian American applicants are routinely downgraded via character and fitness ratings assigned by admissions officials. This process makes a mockery of merit-based admissions and is a naked pretense for simple racial balancing that intentionally decreases Asian American representation and that of other applicants on the basis of their skin color and ethnicity that is reminiscent of 20th century efforts by the same institution to limit enrollment of Jewish students. Notwithstanding this insidious discrimination against Asian Americans, the present administration has not only failed to address it, it has actively worked to preserve it. One of the first actions this administration took in February 2021 was to dismiss a Justice Department lawsuit launched against Yale University during the Trump administration for illegally discriminating against undergraduate applicants based on their race and national origin. When later given the opportunity by the Supreme Court to state its position on the Harvard litigation, the administration once again betrayed the Asian American community by opposing the Supreme Court reviewing the case. Luckily, the court disregarded the suggestion and will render its judgment. The discrimination in college admissions is only the tip of the iceberg. Even grade schools such as nearby Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology, which we've heard about today, are implementing efforts plainly targeted at reducing enrollment of disfavored races and ethnicities, specifically Asian Americans. Just last week, the judge in the case challenging this racial balancing wrote a stinging rebuke, calling the practice patently unconstitutional. I'm relieved that the courts and other institutions appear to be serious about addressing what has become all too common discrimination in American society. Congress can steal these efforts by demanding respect for its civil rights decrees, stating plainly that racial discrimination is illegal. We ought to carefully and thoughtfully work to eliminate racial discrimination in a country that in so many ways over its history has sanctioned it, not just for preferred races, but for every single individual. This is good and serious work, and I'm both professionally and personally committed to it. I've clearly focused my remarks on Asian American discrimination because it's near and dear to my heart. My mother-in-law came to this country in the 1960s as a Vietnamese refugee. My wife is part Vietnamese. My daughter, my son, my brother-in-law, my family is multiracial like so many other families in this beautiful country. I want to remove any impediments any of them may for immutable characteristics such as ethnicity face to equal opportunity. I want that for every other man, woman, and child in this country. We will never achieve that, however, by focusing on what is euphemistically referred to as equity. That concept requires explicit and overt discrimination and a disregard for the Enlightenment and therefore American fundamental principle of equality under law. The insistence that we must produce equal outcomes among groups defined by skin color, national origin, or gender perverts the American understanding of justice based on individual rights. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Westall. And I hope the witnesses understand that because we have so many, we just have to keep to the time. I'm going to keep the members to the time, too. Okay, next we have Amrith Kaur Akre. And please tell me if I've mispronounced your name. She is the legal director of the Sikh Coalition, a role that she's held since 2017. In this role, she focuses on high-impact litigation and oversees all legal work while managing initiatives to protect the civil rights of all Americans in areas such as workplace discrimination, hate crimes, school bullying, racial and religious profiling, and general religious rights policy issues. Under her leadership, the Sikh Coalition's legal team has successfully litigated religious accommodation and bias-based school bullying cases, advocated on behalf of hate crime victims, and provided rapid response legal services. They've also submitted public comment to numerous federal agencies regarding fair interpretations of their policies, as well as testimony before the EOC regarding emerging employment discrimination issues, including those arising from the COVID-19 pandemic. Prior to joining the Sikh Coalition, she served as Cook County Assistant State's Attorney in Chicago for 11 years. She received her JD from the University of Illinois at Chicago, John Marshall School of Law, and her BA from George Washington University. Ms. Akre, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Adler and Cohen, Ranking Member Johnson, Vice Chair Ross, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for welcoming me here today to testify. My name is Amrith Kaur Akre, and I am a dedicated public servant and former prosecutor. And today I join you in my capacity as the legal director for the Sikh Coalition. When 9/11 happened, however, I was a college student serving as the president of the George Washington University Sikh Students Association. I'll never forget the fear, anger, and disbelief that I felt while watching the Pentagon burn from my rooftop. But as soon as I realized the hijackers' pictures depicted them with brown skin, turbans, and beards, just like my father and so many other relatives, I felt something else too. An immediate recognition that the Sikh American community would be targeted with backlash. As a minority religious group, Sikhs understand the intersection of violence, trauma, and discrimination. Its impact is great and paralyzing, and I knew that we didn't have a voice to combat it. From September to October of 2001, the Sikh Coalition tracked more than 300 incidents of bias and bigotry impacting Sikhs across the nation. In fact, as you've heard today, the first person killed in a post-9/11 hate crime was a turban Sikh man shot to death in Arizona on September 15th. And while we can never stop focusing on the urgent threat of hate crimes, they are only part of the story. Since 9/11, our country has seen discrimination continue to permeate every aspect of our society. Workplace discrimination harms Sikhs in a range of public and private sector jobs, including transportation, entertainment, healthcare, the military, and law enforcement, by allowing for the biased interpretation and application of government policies and laws. We've seen Sikhs willing to put their lives on the line in defense of their cities and country, only to be told that uniform and grooming policies prohibit their articles of faith. We have seen Sikhs ordered to cut their hair for work-related drug testing, even when alternative means are readily available. And we've seen Sikh first responders in the fight against COVID-19 pressured to shave their religiously mandated beards instead of being given appropriate, safe, personal protective equipment that doesn't interfere with their faith. Regardless of the details, time and again, these policies are interpreted in a way which disproportionately impacts minority communities, and our system allows it to keep happening. We also receive Sikh travelers' reports of inappropriate demands to remove articles of faith, discriminatory comments by TSA agents, and other profiling in our airports. This is a humiliating hindrance for Sikhs and other religious and racial minorities, members of the transgender community, and others. And additional discriminatory practices like no-fly lists and the lingering effects of the previous administration's Muslim ban continue to perpetuate profiling against too many people. Sadly, even our children are not exempt. Per a 2014 Sikh Coalition study, Sikh students who maintain turbans, other head coverings, or unshorn hair are bullied at a rate twice the national average. Students have been called slurs like terrorists by their peers and teachers alike, and many are subject to physical violence. Worse, families are often left without recourse when administrators refuse to respond. School discrimination can take other forms as well, including keeping Sikh students from participating in sports or going on field trips because of their articles of faith. Now, I want to be clear, anti-Sikh bias and discrimination existed well before 9/11, but the events of that day, the way our politics and culture changed in response, and the manner in which our government policies and regulations continue to be interpreted have all institutionalized that discrimination, and Congress must take action. First, you can fight workplace discrimination by equalizing the Title VII legal standard that currently allows employers to discriminate against workers who require religious accommodations if the requests pose more than a de minimis cost. Second, you can pass the End Racial and Religious Profiling Act and the No Ban Act, both of which will reduce profiling against Sikhs and other marginalized groups. And third, you can amend Title VI to ensure that the Department of Education prevents religious-based bullying. Additionally, we must continue to bring new perspectives into the halls of power, including elected office, agency appointments, and the judiciary, which all lack Sikh voices to affect the creation, implementation, and fair interpretation of our laws. And finally, we must continue to confidently assert the value of diversity and inclusion in our society, despite controversy and backlash. I thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Our final witness is Annetta Sacharon. She is the Executive Director of the Chaya Community Development Corporation, a housing and economic justice organization serving Indo-Caribbean and South Asian New Yorkers. Previously, she was the Director for Policy and Advocacy at United Neighborhood Houses, advocating on behalf of 500,000 low-income New Yorkers served by New York City's settlement houses. From 2001 to 2009, she served as the Executive Director of South Asian Youth Action, the pioneering organization dedicated to ensuring success of low-income South Asian and Indo-Caribbean youth in New York City. A Guyanese, please correct me if my pronunciation is not right, immigrant, she holds an MA in International Political Economy and Development from Fordham University, a BA in Political Science from Manhattanville College, and an executive management certificates from Harvard and Columbia Business Schools. You are recognized now for 5 minutes. Please unmute.
My apologies. Chairman Cohen, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Annetta Sacharon. I am an immigrant from Guyana and the Executive Director of Chaya Community Development Corporation. Thank you for the opportunity to speak before you today. My testimony is based on my work with South Asian communities in New York City over the past 2 decades through 2 formidable crises. When 9/11 happened, I was the Executive Director of South Asian Youth Action, SAYA. And over the course of the pandemic, I have been serving as the Executive Director of Chaya Community Development Corporation, a Queens-based nonprofit serving South Asian and Indo-Caribbean New Yorkers. Over the past 20 years, I have witnessed how our communities confront a myriad of challenges layered on top of crisis after crisis. Looking back at the 9/11 attacks and its aftermath brings up many emotions for me. One of my cousins lost her husband in the South Tower. Yet, at a time of heart-wrenching grief, my family was also targets of verbal abuse and attacks. Days following the collapse of the towers, my family went to St. Vincent's Hospital with the hope of finding my cousin's husband. There, people shouted at us, "This is your fault." Later, at a 9/11 memorial service, my mother was told, "Get out of this country." Our experiences reflect the double grieving that many South Asians, Muslims, Arabs, and Sikhs endured in the hours, days, and months after 9/11. We grieved for the terrible losses on that day, and we grieved because we knew that a backlash was on its way, targeting and scapegoating our communities. This backlash manifested in different ways, from interpersonal violence to state policies that led to arrests, detentions, and deportations. Young Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs who visited Saya's community center shared how they were being followed by law enforcement, how they were afraid to take the subway or fly, or how they were being bullied at school. People became worried about doing the most routine activities, going to places of worship, eating at South Asian restaurants, going to Muslim schools, and visiting public parks. The cumulative impact of 2 decades of interpersonal and state violence is profound. And as a result, young people made different educational and vocational choices because of their outsider status. Many experienced heightened isolation, depression, and anxiety, which are still sources of trauma today, 2 decades later. There is a through line between the post-9/11 environment and today. Government agencies did not invest the necessary resources in our communities to ensure our well-being, despite the tremendous need in the wake of 9/11. Instead, government resources were allocated towards profiling and surveillance. This is true even as South Asians are one of the fastest growing immigrant groups in the country. There are 5.4 million South Asians living in the United States, with ancestry from Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, and the diaspora, including Trinidad and Tobago, my country, Guyana, Fiji, Tanzania, and Kenya. There is immense socioeconomic and educational diversity within the South Asian community. For example, in New York City, Nepali immigrants have the highest rate of uninsurance. Bangladeshi and Pakistani immigrants have some of the highest rates of poverty at 32% and 29% respectively. In the pandemic, an already challenging situation became much worse. In the wake of national crises, we must move through several phases: recovery, redress, reinvestment, and reconciliation. When it comes to 9/11, however, we seem to have barely scratched the surface, even though it's been 20 years. Congress can take steps, including investing in the well-being of communities affected by the 9/11 backlash, by making long-term investments towards social services, recreation, education, as well as neighborhood programs and cultural and community spaces. Additionally, implementing equitable immigration policies, such as a pathway for citizenship for undocumented immigrants, temporary protective status for Nepalis, and providing supports to Afghan refugees. Our community groups have been responding with care and solidarity for 2 decades. We call for more hearings like this around the country to fully understand the depth of the impact on our communities. Further recommendations are in my written testimony. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your testimony, and thank all the panelists for joining us today. We will now proceed with questions from the committee under the 5-minute rule, and I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Again, this has been very powerful testimony from all of our panelists and from our members of Congress who led off this morning's proceedings. For too long, Muslim, Arab, and South Asian American communities in the United States have been the targets of unfair and unwarranted suspicion, scapegoating, and stigmatization. In the aftermath of the attacks on our country on 9/11, these groups faced intense interpersonal discrimination and violence, as well as discriminatory government policies that were implemented at the federal and state levels. These policies have subjected Muslim and Arab communities to intense government surveillance and investigation under the guise of counterterrorism and national security. For instance, following a policy change in 2002 requiring all aliens to register their change of address within 10 days of moving, a Palestinian legal immigrant was pulled over in my home state of North Carolina for driving 4 miles over the speed limit. He was detained for 2 months and eventually charged with a misdemeanor for failing to report his change of address. Between 2000 and 2009, hate crimes against Muslims in the United States increased by 500%, and rates of attacks against these groups remain troublingly high to this day. Unfortunately, in my home state of North Carolina, we are familiar with violent attacks against Muslims. In 2015, 3 young Muslim university students were brutally murdered by their neighbor when they were sitting down to have dinner. While the perpetrator ultimately pled guilty to first-degree murder, he was never charged with a hate crime. In recent years, there have been numerous reports across the state of verbal and physical assaults on Muslim women who wore head coverings. The Muslim, Arab, and South Asian American populations in my district continue to grow, and these groups are an essential part of the diverse and rich culture of the Research Triangle area of North Carolina. It's critical that we continue to examine the experiences of these communities in the United States and do everything we can to prevent unwarranted acts of discrimination and hatred against them. My first question is for our councilwoman from Tennessee. How has government surveillance of Muslim communities, including mosques and Muslim organizations, undermined the relationship between community members and law enforcement?
Thank you. That's a very great question, because part of the work that AMAC was doing was actually trying to work between the law enforcement and the Muslim community. And we would actually have meetings with new recruits to talk about how to deal with the Muslim community as a way to make sure that, there's a cooperation on all sides. But every time there's a surveillance, every time that there's a profiling, then it sets our community back, because it feels as if here we are again. No matter what we do, it's never enough. And so this act of surveillance is something that it's counterproductive to the work that we all want to do. If the intent is security, if the intent is making everybody safe, then it's important for our law enforcement to work with the community rather than spying on them and going behind their back. And so in my community, what I've seen is that people don't want to cooperate. People don't want to speak up. People don't want to come to the mosque because they feel like their privacy is being violated. So it is very detrimental to the work that my organization, AMAC, was trying to do, and it's still very detrimental to the citizens in my community.
Thank you very much for that response. Maya Berry, and I know we only have a minute left because I'm adhering to the time too, but how have the United States immigration policies fed in to this discrimination and this systemic abuse of people who are here legally and just our citizens and neighbors?
I think one of the most deeply impactful way that it's been negative is that it views our communities as this existential other, continuously foreign or otherized in a way that's just not consistent with both the history of our country, given we're all immigrants to this wonderful nation, and it's important that we understand it as not also keeping us safe. Like part of what you'll hear from, I think, many of our testimony, the witnesses today, is that these policies put us in some ways more at risk rather than protect us.
Thank you very much. I am now going to turn the gavel over to Congresswoman Jackson Lee to preside, because I have to be somewhere else, and then we'll hear from our ranking member. But thank you all for your testimony and for your time today. I now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes, so he can talk while Ms. Jackson Lee comes up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Nomani, in recent years, equality has been replaced with equity as the central focus of the modern civil rights movement. And we've seen how this has played out in a number of contexts, and you've testified today. It's been very compelling about how this has had a real effect in the public education context. Your testimony was really amazing. I mean, so the local school officials actually went to your minority community, and simply because you expressed your views as concerned parents about the curriculum, they said, and these are your quotes, "We need a different kind of minority." They said, you must check your privileges at the door, whatever in the world that means, and that you're white adjacent. I mean, how offensive is that? Yet you took a stand. All of you got together. You took a stand, and you rounded up the parents group. You started the Coalition for TJ, the Thomas Jefferson High School in Northern Virginia. And you just won in court, as you said, against this really insidious racism of critical race theory-centered policies that are a scourge upon the nation right now. So here's the question. How can other parent groups organize and stand together like you all have? Because I think this is very inspiring and instructional for other people.
Thank you so much, Representative Johnson, and thank you to all of the representatives on the House Judiciary Committee that have actually had the backs of parents. We are ordinary moms and dads, and we did not choose to have fights with our school boards or with principals. But in fact, we have decided that there are positions of value that matter to us. And what we want to encourage every parent is to have courage, have moral courage. And everybody who wants to shut us down needs to understand that nobody comes between a parent and their baby. Nobody comes between a parent and the child's education. And so what we want to do at Parents Defending Education, we invite people to register their parent groups, come to us and get tips on how to speak to the school board, how to file a Freedom of Information Act request. And what I want to encourage your Democratic lawmakers also to do is to take the letter that the Republican leaders, the committee, sent just yesterday, asking serious questions about the new oversight, surveillance, and monitoring that is happening of parents. Every single thing that was said here today is now being done to parents. And that is unconstitutional and illegal. And I really hope that your Democratic lawmakers will also team up with you to understand that parents are our friends. They are not the enemy. Absolutely, and showing moral courage inspires courage in others, and that's what's so important. It's a big part of what it means to be an American, to stand against this kind of stuff. The Republicans in our committee stood together, and we are very concerned about the weaponization of the Department of Justice, and no one lower than the Attorney General himself. The source of your T-shirt, they labeled concerned parents as domestic terrorists for expressing their views about what's happening in their curriculum. And so we're on top of that. We are seeking some oversight. We'll make sure that we don't weaponize the federal government against concerned parents, at least after the next election cycle. Mr. Westhill, I got to move on because I don't have a lot of time, but I wanted to ask you, you began to explain how the new advancement of equity as the benchmark is inconsistent with our civil rights laws and constitutional protections. You used the word or the phrase affirmative discrimination. Could you unpack that just a little bit more, in a minute and a half here?
Sure, thank you very much for the question, Ranking Member Johnson. Affirmative discrimination is essentially plain old discrimination, like we've known in this country for many, many years. It just happens to be the case that it's being used in an official format at educational institutions, in contracting, in businesses, and it's the sort of thing that is the overt racial discrimination of the past that we were hoping we would get past in this country at some point, come back on steroids. That's what I mean.
Well, that's right. And there are elements in our politics and in the culture right now, the radical left, they're recasting racism and discrimination and equality for this zeal of equal outcomes, this quixotic quest that's not going to happen. Equity is dangerous. It's a poison to our system. It impedes actual progress in improving race relations and opportunity in the United States. And I think parents, citizens, people are beginning to recognize this, and they need more avenues to express their outrage. We have election cycles. There's one component of that, but I'm really grateful for the work that both of you are doing in organizations that you lead and others like it, because this is the way we affect change in America. So thanks for being here. Thanks for your time. All of our witnesses for your time today. I yield back.
Thank you to the ranking member. Your time has expired. My pleasure now to yield to the chairman of the full committee, Chairman Nadler, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Sacharon, how has the legacy of the 9/11 attack continued to impact South Asian communities in New York?
Thank you, Representative Nadler, for that question, and I want to thank you for your leadership. What I have witnessed over the pandemic is that the already weak and disenfranchised circumstances in which our community members found themselves, that is directly tied to the lack of investment in our communities after 9/11, made them that much more vulnerable to the pandemic. They were members of our community, who, such as in Southeast Queens, that experienced the highest infection rates, yet it was impossible to get appropriate help and attention during the pandemic. And in the rebuilding and recovery process, say of our small businesses, while our small businesses are trying to rebuild, they still struggle with discrimination and cultural isolation, language barriers, et cetera.
Thank you. Ms. Akri, your testimony noted that Sikhs continue to face difficulty in accessing workplaces in a range of sectors and industries. What kinds of barriers do religious minorities face in workplaces where Title VII fails to protect their civil rights and civil liberties?
Thank you, Congressman. As you know, under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, employers are prohibited from discriminating against employees on the basis of religion. The biggest issue is that the threshold under Title VII for employers to deny the provision of a religious accommodation is extremely low. All they have to do is show that there's a de minimis cost, often interpreted as any cost, associated with providing the request, and then they can successfully overcome that Title VII standard. It's really the lowest legal standard for any civil rights provision and leaves religious minorities out on an island of isolation, segregation, and failure to hire. And I believe that that is one of the largest issues that comes to the floor when we're talking about workplace discrimination against Sikhs and other religious minorities.
What standard would you suggest?
Well, under the ADA, for example, there's a higher threshold, which is the undue hardship standard. It's much more difficult for employers to overcome that burden. The balancing test is much more in favor of employees that are seeking an accommodation. I believe that that is the standard that would be more appropriate for religious accommodations as well.
Thank you. Professor Wadia, I wanted to ask you to elaborate on some of your testimony, even though Ms. Ross asked Ms. Barry about the same thing. Your testimony describes how in the years following 9/11, the federal government developed several new immigration policies in the name of national security. Can you describe how these policies impacted Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities?
Thank you for the question. And really the history predates 9/11. But in the 9/11 context, I spoke in my oral testimony about the special registration program, and the immigration consequences included, for example, someone receiving a charging document and being placed in deportation proceedings, an individual because of an overstay being deported, an individual because of a failure to register, because maybe they did not even know about the special registration program, being denied an immigration benefit or a green card years later while sitting in an immigration office during an adjustment interview. We saw other 9/11 policies that were in the name of national security, but in fact, immigration changes. And so some of those consequences included, for example, the detention of 1,200 men who were broadly labeled as September 11th detainees, coming largely from Mosques communities. We also saw an absconder initiative where individuals who had orders of removal were identified, targeted, and punished by the federal government. So these are some of the examples, if you connect the dots, in which national security was used as a proxy for immigration policy and then led to serious immigration consequences. What we didn't see is a great gain in finding the next terrorist. And so what the fallout and collateral damage was in the immigration space.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Let me call upon Mr. Jordan for his 5 minutes, the ranking member of the full
He
committee.
is not here for now, so we can go forward. The chair has other members of her party.
And so continue in our membership. Thank you so very much, Mr. Johnson. And now, pleased to call the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. A couple of our colleagues have referred to discrimination as something that's taken place in the past. And, you know, for those of us who lived through January the 6th, we saw old-fashioned white nationalism and racism alive and well at our front door. There were members of extremist groups, including the Aryan Nations and Klansmen and the militia groups, that came to smash our windows, beat the daylights out of our police officers, knock down our doors, and interrupt the counting of electoral college votes for the first time in American history. And I'm just surprised to hear people referring to racism as something that took place in the past when we're seeing the evidence of it all around us today, including most recently at the gathering of Nick Fuentes with the radical right, a known anti-Semite, and he was visited by none other than a couple of our colleagues, Marjorie Taylor Greene being one of them, and they were there just a few days ago. So let me start with Ms. Swara. Can you tell me how government surveillance of Muslim communities, including mosques and Muslim groups, has undermined relationships between community members and law enforcement, and is that still taking place?
Thank you. Yes, surveillance of the Muslim community is counterproductive and it's very dangerous. Basically, when we learn of surveillance in our community, it makes our community members feel as the other, as if we're un-American, as if our government did not trust us. Because these things is not something that is happening everywhere, it's happening in our own community. And so every time that happens, it makes the job of someone like myself very difficult. Because when I'm talking to people, I try to tell members of my community, we are Americans, we pay taxes, we deserve the same rights, and we deserve equal protection from our government. And we deserve the respect and the privacy like everyone else. But every time the surveillance happens or profiling of the community, it sets the clock back. It leads to lack of trust in the government, and that is counterproductive to what we want to do as government.
Thank you. I have a question for Dean Wadia. Can you explain what the civil liberties and human consequences were of President Trump's Muslim bans that he began his administration with?
Thank you for the question. There were significant human consequences and policy harms with the various versions of the Muslim ban. I'll share a few. One, included a sort of vast, invisible family separation policy that continues to this day. So people in qualifying family relationships, a U.S. citizen married to a Yemeni, were unable to be together and were otherwise excluded. A Syrian student courted by a university for a PhD program could be denied and not be enrolled in the program because of the ban. An Iranian mother who was seeking to visit the United States to see the birth of her first grandchild, unable to travel to the United States because of the ban. So those were some of the harms that were direct. There are also lasting harms, right? There are procedural impediments that still make it impossible for individuals who were separated or affected to be reunited, even after the ban has been repealed, because of costs, because of bureaucracies, and so on. Finally,
if I could interrupt for 1 second, are you finding that discriminatory immigration policies and law enforcement policies are the things that are of major concern to the communities that we're talking about today? Or are people more upset about what's called critical race theory? And I'm not even quite sure what they mean by that. But are people most concerned about policies like the Muslim ban and discriminatory policies in law enforcement, or are they more concerned about the thing called critical race theory?
I'm here concerned about the people. And that includes those who have been harmed and continue to be harmed by policies that the government has a choice to change. It boils down to choices.
Thank you, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
The gentleman yields back. It's my pleasure to yield to the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Jordan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Professor Wadia, are you a proponent of critical race theory?
I teach with the statute as my centerpiece. So I start with the immigration statute. I do think it's important to also talk about the history of how the statute has evolved. So my students are able to connect the dots between the history of the immigration statute, which has been compared second in complication to the U.S. tax code.
Well, let me ask it this way. Let me ask it this way, Professor. I'm sorry. Do you support critical race theory being taught in our K through 12 schools or in higher education?
It's a term that has had many meanings. I do support teaching history, and I do.
Well, we all support that.
So that's how I would answer the question, Congressman.
Well, you believe discrimination based on race is wrong, right?
I do.
Okay, so one of the key proponents of critical race theory, Ibram X. Kendi, said this, quote, "The defining question is whether the discrimination is creating equity or inequity. If discrimination is creating equity, then it's okay." Do you agree with that statement?
I believe that if we have, and I will speak as an immigration expert, if we have immigration policies that explicitly target people based on their country of birth or their religion, I think that's a problematic policy.
No, but that's not what I asked you. I asked this, if equity is achieved through discrimination, is that discrimination okay? Because the key proponent of critical race theory says it is. I just want to know if you think it is. If equity is achieved through discrimination, is that discrimination okay?
I can frame the question of equity only in a different way, because I answer these questions through the lens of immigration. And so if you want me to answer about where I stand on immigration, I would say that if we have immigration policies.
Well, let me do this then. Mr. Westhill, do you think Asian Americans who've been denied entrance into certain institutions, do you think they are okay with equity being achieved, so-called equity being achieved at some of these schools of higher learning through discrimination? Do you think they're okay with that?
Thank you, Congressman Jordan. No, I don't.
No, because it's real to them, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I will add that I don't know when racial or ethnic discrimination in any form became controversial, but my testimony here, I think, should clearly not be controversial, but it is.
I know. For the life of me, I don't know why it is either. Let me just quickly go to Ms. Nomani. Thank you for being here. So I noticed your shirt. It says, "I'm a mom, not a domestic terrorist." This is an issue that this committee has at least the Republicans have. Once we learned about the memorandum from the Attorney General, memorandum targeting, you got it right there. Well, you got the letter right there from the School Board Association. But I'm just curious, do you think, as someone who's been active in defending the rights of parents, moms and dads in our schools, are you nervous about this now because of a whistleblower who came forward and gave us the email sent from the FBI to agents around the country talking about this threat tag label being placed on parents? Are you nervous that that designation, that label, that tag may be now associated with your name?
I know that we are now under surveillance as parents. We are seeing it in local authorities, state authorities, and federal authorities. And if everybody here is in agreement that they do not want surveillance and undue persecution of any human being, that should include parents. And I applaud you all for just being there for the mama bears and papa bears. Because you know what? We are in the trenches and we are fighting. And it was a mom in Fairfax County, Virginia, who revealed to us that Attorney General Merrick Garland's son-in-law is benefiting from the big tech company contracts with school boards. And so what I want to encourage every parent to do is just be a Nancy Drew, Hardy Boy, whichever way it is, in your school district. File those Freedom of Information Act requests, and that's how we got the emails that traced exactly this school board letter to the White House.
Madam Chair, I would just reiterate the numerous times that Republicans have asked to have the Attorney General back. Remember, his testimony that day said in no way were they treating parents as domestic terrorists, when in fact the day before he made that statement, that email went out to FBI agents around the country that said, put this designation on moms and dads. So once again, we need the Attorney General back here to answer some critical questions, and frankly, what we really need is for him to rescind the memorandum and stop this process he has put in place that is targeting moms and dads. With that, I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. I ask members who wish to question to turn on their cameras so that we might be able to call on you appropriately because you're very much a part of this hearing. With that in mind, it's my privilege to yield to the Vice Chair of, I think I'm in my other committee, but be able to yield from the gentlelady from Missouri for her 5 minutes, Congresswoman Bush. I've given you 2 vice chairs, but I'm delighted that you're the Vice Chair of the Crime Subcommittee. So you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
St. Louis, yes. St. Louis and I thank you for this important hearing. The surveillance and criminalization of Muslims is older than this nation's founding. Many seem to forget that enslaved Black people were forcibly brought to this country, starting in 1619 from across the African continent, including regions that were predominantly Muslim, which meant that thousands of people who came to this country through the slave trade over 400 years ago were Muslim. Enslaved Black Muslims practiced their faith in secret out of fear of retaliation. They resisted slavery. They fought for our liberation, and many recorded their experiences in Arabic or other languages to avoid suspicion. The history of Black Muslims in this country is American history. And I sit here as a Congresswoman and lawmaker to say our history will not be erased. Our history, including the history of mass surveillance of Muslims, and that extends much further than September 11th to the targeting of Black nationalists in the 1920s, and then the Nation of Islam by the FBI's COINTELPRO. Surveillance, intimidation, and targeting based primarily on the perception that Black Muslim Americans in pursuit of Black liberation somehow pose a threat to society because of their religious and racial identity. Today, Black people make up 20% of our country's Muslim population and are facing surveillance and criminalization. In documentation that was recovered from the New York Police Department's mapping and surveillance of Muslims, American Black Muslims were included in the list of ancestries of interest. Ms. Swara, can you talk about the impact of post 9/11 policies on Black Muslims?
Thank you so much for that question. Black Muslims are facing attack 2 ways: prongs as Black in the face of all the discrimination and racism that comes from being Black in America, but also being Muslims. We have policies at the state level that marginalize Black Americans and Muslim Americans. A couple of state legislation in my state talks about indoctrination in schools, talks about no-go zones that are not existent. There's a report about driving while Black in my state that talks about how people that are Black or brown are targeted and profiled and stopped in different ways more than any other member of the community. And because of all of that, I think when I talk about this discriminatory policy, I always look at it from what it's doing to our children that are born here, that are citizens here, that see all these things being thrown against them, that see their government telling them that they do not belong or they do not have the same right. So a lot of policies, as a Black American, as a Muslim American, tells me that I do not belong, tells me that I do not belong in a space with my other colleagues. And that is very discriminatory. So a lot of them, there's a lot in my statement about examples of some of those policies that we've had at the national and at the state level.
Thank you for making that very clear for everyone. Thank you so much. Professor Alam, can you talk about the ways in which surveillance against Muslim communities is used to target other communities and protesters more generally?
Representative Bush, I'm not certain if you meant Professor Wadia or myself.
Yes, to you.
Thank you, Representative Bush. There are several connections to be made across surveillance of other communities. What we've seen is, when you mentioned, starting with surveillance of Black Muslim groups in particular in the 20th century, the Moorish Science Temple and Nation of Islam, which were seen as foreign and suspect, and much of it has continued to this day. The same methods of policing and surveillance and using race, ethnicity, and national origin as a proxy, as the primary indicator for suspicion continues today. I detailed some of that in my testimony. We detailed some of that in my written statement. But it's also happening, for instance, with Chinese nationals in this country. Chinese students, for instance, are being marked for suspicion. And that's something that we've worked on, and we've worked persistently to actually dismantle that entire system by which the federal government essentially uses its policing and surveillance powers to mark communities on the basis of their race or national origin and seeing them as suspects simply on those bases. That's happening across communities. That's happening with Asian American communities, Muslim American communities, and has been happening, of course, with Black communities in America for a very long time.
Thank you. Just really briefly, according to a 2019 study released by Muslim advocates, Muslims make up 9% of those incarcerated in state prisons, though they only make up 1% of the US population. Chairwoman, I ask for unanimous consent to introduce the Muslim advocate study mentioned above into the record. Thank you, and I yield back.
Without objection, so ordered. Gentlelady's time has expired. Thank you very much for your questioning. Let me determine whether Mr. McClintock is ready. Mr. Roy, Mr. Fishback, Mr. Owens. Just wanted to make sure, one, we thank them for being part of the committee and just did not want to not give them an opportunity for their 5 minutes. And so it's my privilege now to yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Garcia.
Apologize, I had to rush to the floor to make some remarks, and I rushed back because I did want to have my opportunity to ask a few questions. And I wanted to thank Madam Chair, the Chairman, Mr. Cohen, and everyone involved in putting this together, because this, of course, is a very important topic, one that has been, in the forefront of a lot of attention and use. I also want to thank all the witnesses and also our members of Congress who are here in the panel before you, who shared their very, very personal stories. Hate crimes, racial profiling, and harassment have become widespread in our innately diverse nation because of hateful, racist, and divisive rhetoric stemming from our own political and governmental institutions. Racial profiling is patently unconstitutional, but because of vague or overbroad statutes, law enforcement authorities and other government agencies have a de facto blank check to persecute people of color under the color of law. I sympathize deeply with our Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. I know that for me in my district, that is overwhelmingly Latino, we have and continue to experience systematic and interpersonal violence because of how we look and who we are. And for those of you who have mentioned people wrongfully getting on a no-fly list, for the record, let me say I was on the no-fly list probably for 2 or 3 years, and it took me probably another 2 or 3 years to get off that list, because somehow there was a Sylvia Rodriguez Garcia somewhere that was suspect or had a same or similar name to mine, and mine got picked up. So I've experienced this. So I want to start there with Mr. Scree. Do you have specific recommendations on how TSA can avoid infringing on travelers' civil rights and civil liberties while simultaneously protecting our nation, which of course is their mission? Is he still on? Did I mispronounce the name? I'm so sorry. It's for Amers Cause Akri.
Oh, thank you, Congresswoman. Thank you for that question. TSA profiling for Sikh Americans and other minority groups has always been a problem. Bias against travelers is prevalent at every stage of the traveling process. And it starts with the fact that the TSA agents do not receive adequate training on TSA policies or cultural competencies, which is evident from the moment many stigmatized groups arrive at the airport and have to go through behavioral detection before reaching security. It continues as these passengers pass through security, proceed past the security screening area, and in many cases, even as those individuals are boarding flights. TSA needs better technology. They need clearer and more transparent screening standards. They need increased oversight, and they need mechanisms in place to ensure that civil rights compliance takes place. Right now, there's a lot of ambiguous discretion that contribute to profiling, even where the technology says an individual is not a threat. The overly broad discretion that's provided to TSA agents to screen travelers without clear or articulable thresholds and standards of review that are required by a lot of other law enforcement agencies, travelers are often going to feel profiled without any real basis for why they were selected.
Right. And do you have concerns about bias in the algorithms, bias in the coding of some of the technology that further perpetuates discrimination?
Yes, Congresswoman, that's right. You know, in 2012, we created a tool called Fly Rights that allows for people to file complaints against TSA in a more accessible way. Once that tool was launched, we realized that there were a number of people that were sort of being screened and, you know, provided with additional sort of levels of heightened security and screening in matters that were related both to the way the technology is used and in matters of discretion that TSA agents had in implementing and applying the technology. Now, the reality is the technology that exists is only as good as the people that are manning it and monitoring it. And in this case, while the algorithms might also include levels of bias, and I'm sure they do, what we've also recognized is that inadequate training on the parts of the TSA agents when they're implementing that technology and those algorithms will always lead to secondary screening for minority communities, especially minorities like Sikhs who have really visible articles of faith.
Right, because like in my case, the name that I was, you know, got a hit with my name was frankly really very different. I mean, it wasn't even Garcia. The first name wasn't even Sylvia. So whoever coded it or whatever algorithm they used, it was really about every third or fourth letter that was the same. So it took me forever to get off, but fortunately I did. So this really concerns me in terms of our technology and the algorithms and some of the stuff that we've seen even in banking and other services. So thank you so much, and thank you to all the witnesses, and thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Thank you so very much. Let me thank all of the members who are here, and I do want to acknowledge Mr. Johnson and other members who are here, and thank Mr. Cohen and the committee for this hearing, which I am a part of. Let me now address my questions, and I yield myself 5 minutes, the time that may be called upon to finish my questioning. Because I do want to open with that we are a few days away from crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which reflected the shedding of blood for the right to vote by African Americans and other diverse Americans that ultimately joined Dr. King after Bloody Sunday, where our dear friend, late colleague, John Lewis, shed blood, as others did on that bridge. And I'm always moved by the emotion of that moment, of the shedding of blood for freedom. And so let me say that I don't hold Ms. Nomani or to Mr. Westhill any form of discrimination, nor do I think the members of my Democratic colleagues and members of the Democratic Party as well. We do believe, as John has taught us and Dr. King, in the beloved community. But let me try to set the record straight so that this continued miscalculation and politicalization and campaign rhetoric that has really hurt more than helped can be set. Now, there are many definitions to what we've been discussing, but let me put into the record, I think, a reasoned definition of which, if someone has a rebuttal, they can, when I say rebuttal, they have another definition, the record is open for you to submit it. Critical race theory is a cross-disciplinary intellectual and social movement of civil rights scholars and activists who seek to examine the intersection of race and law in the United States and to challenge mainstream America liberal approaches to racial justice. For example, the CRT conceptual framework is one way to study how and why U.S. courts give more lenient punishments to drug dealers from some races than to drug dealers of other races. The word critical in its name is an academic term that refers to critical thinking, critical theory, and scholarly criticism, rather than criticizing or blaming people. It first arose in the 1970s. The other critical schools of thought, such as critical legal studies, which examine how legal rules protect the status quo. It has nothing to do with teaching anyone in elementary school, middle school, or any place else. It is a scholarly effort to address the question of the intersection of law and race. Any books that have been done that have used it is because the author is unclear, imprecise, and without knowledge about that. Parents certainly have the right to engage with their school districts on what they believe is effective for their students. However, I will not accept the abuse of that term to come before us in this hearing that is talking about the absolute discrimination against people who cannot speak for themselves. So let me just show why this African-American young person had to have his hair cut off so that he could effectively participate in sports. And my friends decided to vote against something called the Crown Act, which means that whatever style hair you have is protected under the Constitution. Maybe you're not familiar with the story of Emmett Till. This is what his mother had to confront, this bloodied and mutilated head of a 14-year-old who went to Mississippi, an African-American, who suffered the indignities of violence. So I think this hearing that talks about discrimination in the civil rights of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian American communities is focused on how discrimination laws have undermined it over the period of their time here in the United States in ways that we can try and fix. We are problem solvers. We are grateful that the courts have responded to perceived discrimination. But in any event, what I would clearly say, and you need to put down your camera, please. You need to put down your camera. You need to put down your camera. It's a. I understand that, but I need the witness.
Why do I have to put down my camera?
Because I'm already on video, so I don't need to be on yours.
Is that a committee?
I mean, this is free speech.
There's not a rule on that, right?
I've asked respectfully, and you choose not to be respectful, and so I will allow you to continue on. Thank you so very much. But in any event, I believe that this hearing deals with the impact of discrimination on the groups who have suffered discrimination in such a large way. And so I'd like to make sure that we are focused on that. I'm disappointed that CRT has been politicized to attack people who simply want to ensure that our children have an opportunity to be engaged in diversity. I know that this words that I am saying now in the most calm way will be mutilated by the right-wing media. That is all they do. They do not act in truth, and they do not try to provoke truth. They try to provoke people. And we've been so busy trying to step away from that we saw what happened on January 6th, where, as Congressman Raskin said, they came, they beat, they attacked, they called names, and they made a mockery of democracy, and they attacked the citadel of democracy. That is not what we're doing here in this hearing. So may I ask Ms. Berry, the Trump Muslim ban, various other discriminatory aspects that impact the Asian American community, I want to simply ask you the question: what kind of violence has been generated against Asian Americans and Arab Americans in particular, the Muslim ban that you've seen that has come out of the utilization of the Trump Muslim ban, the attack on how some Muslims may be attired, students in school? How is that atmosphere generated, from your perspective, violent acts against Muslim Americans? Ms. Berry?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, we saw a significant surge in hate crimes in our country. One of the key things that we do at the Arab American Institute is try to increase hate crime data collection and reporting. We believe that data drives policy, and it's incredibly important that we have the accurate data on that. After the last year we have FBI hate crime data for is 2020, and it is literally the second highest year post 9/11. So from the 2016 presidential election to today, we have seen a marked increase in anti-hate against pretty much all communities. And we really do believe, while I'm not here to make a direct correlation between speech and hate, but when it emanates from our lawmakers, when it emanates from the presidential pulpit, it has a very real impact on communities and how they're targeted. And if I may, Congresswoman, I would love to take this opportunity because of what we're talking about here today. One of the most important things, Congresswoman Garcia pointed out that she was able to—
Excuse me, just a moment. Madam Chair, since we've gone so far over, would you permit me an additional time period to ask?
The ranking member always has an additional time period, and then the chair will close. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Congresswoman Garcia was able to remove her name from a no-fly list because the no-fly list actually has a better redress process than the watch list. And I think that's a pretty extraordinary thing. The watch list, we don't even know the size of it. So you don't know you're on it. There are estimations it could be well over 1 million people. That's a problem. We need to have a better due process practices in place. And then the final point I want to make, because I do think this is a historical hearing. This is important that we're examining 20 years later the rights of Arab Americans and American Muslims and South Asians. And one of the most important things we can do as we reflect on that is to actually address the issue of profiling in a very meaningful way. In 2003, then Attorney General Ashcroft issued profiling guidance that said we will not profile.
Barry, if you can summarize.
Sorry. We will not profile in 2003. Regrettably, those loopholes were so big that we issued new guidance in 2014 saying we will not profile. We continue to have a loophole that exists for national security, border security, and local law enforcement. And until we find a remedy for that, regrettably, the policies that we're talking about here today that impact our communities directly, but I would argue all Americans, they will find their way to all Americans, we need to do better.
Thank you. I'd appreciate it if you would submit in writing why is detailed demographic data about the Arab American community important, and what work has your organization been doing to increase such data collection efforts? If you could submit that in writing, I'd appreciate it.
Happy to do so. Thank you.
I'd be interested just in this follow-up to the Sikh community, and I know of the tragedy that has occurred in the Sikh family and religion in Minnesota, but can you describe some of the Sikh Coalition's findings regarding bullying of Sikh youth, and whether or not that also generates into violence against the Sikh community?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for your question. According to multiple surveys that the Sikh Coalition has taken, Sikh American students experience high rates of bullying and harassment in our nation's public schools, and we continue receiving and documenting nationwide reports of school bullying.
Thank you.
Sikh boys who wear turbans are called terrorists, and girls are teased for having long hair. and many of these children are subjected to violence. Our research shows that the majority of sick children, just over 50% of which have endured school bullying. Over 2/3 or 67% reported that they were bullied in school, and turban sick children experience bullying at more than double the national rate. We know that it occurs not just on school grounds, but also on buses and increasingly on social media, such as Facebook, Twitter, and anonymous mobile phone apps. And despite the growing recognition of bullying as a national problem, lawmakers and school officials are not collecting comprehensive bullying data, and their enforcement of these anti-bullying policies that exist are completely inconsistent. We also know that Title IV is being used to enforce religious bullying by the Department of Justice. However, religious discrimination is not explicitly investigated by the Department of Education because it's not a protected category under Title VI. So that's an area where bullied kids are left without full access to recourse when they've suffered.
Thank you very much. Appreciate those questions, and we'll have other questions submitted into the record. It's my pleasure to yield some time to the ranking member.
I thank you, Madam Chair. As is often our custom when we have witnesses take their time and come to appear before us, and we see them chomping at the bit, we know there may be something they would like to add to the testimony or what's been said. So I would yield to Ms. Nomani for that.
Thank you so much, Representative Johnson. I just think that it is unconscionable, but completely predictable what we have just witnessed today. Because while there has been serious conversation about the need to address issues of discrimination, surveillance, and other issues of privacy and constitutionality, not one person from the Democratic side has taken seriously the very real discrimination that is happening now in the name of critical race theory. But instead, I was ridiculed. And then when I dared to try to take a video of this, I was intimidated, just like parents face in school boards and school districts all across the country. And do you know what? A federal judge has validated what we have said to our school board for 2 years.
Right.
We have been ignored. And the one thing that I think every Democratic lawmaker should recognize as a word of advice is that the parents spoke up in Virginia, and they elected Governor Glenn Youngkin. The parents spoke up in San Francisco, and they recalled 3 school board members. And who was one of those school board members? She was this woman who dared to use the N-word about Asians, calling us the House N-word. And she has now lost her job. There is a very real discrimination with the privilege matrix, the oppression matrix that is targeting brown and black parents and children. And then also, we must care about all children. This is a very real book. Not my idea, and it's certainly not my idea. It says whiteness is a bad deal, and then a contract with the devil. No child in America should ever feel shame. No child should ever feel discrimination, and it is unconscionable that we do not recognize that we cannot replace one hierarchy of human value with another hierarchy of human value. We must protect the integrity of humanity.
That is so well said. And, I'll just close with this and I'll yield back, but we used to all agree upon Dr. King's admonition that we be judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin. And this has now gone full circle the other way. People are being discriminated against because of what they look like. And I thought that's what we were all against. But CRT is doing this. It is insidious, and they're putting it in the curriculum. And however well-intended some people may think that it was at its origin, Madam Chair, it has turned into a weapon that is being used against children. And that is detestable, and we will stand against it at every turn. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you to the ranking member. This committee is well poised to respond to discrimination against any child in whatever form it takes. This committee is noted as the truth sayer for the Constitution. And so I think it is important that we make sure that our facts are accurate and not distorted. We embrace all people who come to stand against discrimination. Ms. Johnson, we have worked together on some issues. I take no backseat to that, nor do I have any reason to take any suggestion that my Democratic colleagues do not stand against discrimination in any form. And so I again refer, as I close this hearing, to the beloved community. I cited what critical race theory is. It has obviously had many different changes. It's been reinterpreted in the wrong way. I hope that the more we get to understand each other, even starting in early education, that we are a better nation, we are unified, and that we become the beloved community. Seeing us juxtaposed against each other in high tension, misinterpreting comments as maligning or misrepresenting is unfortunate. But again, this hearing has been productive. We will find ways to respond to the pain that has been expressed here, and we'll find ways to do it under the umbrella of Dr. King's admonition of our character and who we are, but certainly of that of my friend and the late colleague, John Lewis, and that is the beloved community. I remain as that. Let us hope that the recounting of this hearing takes everyone's facts in a way that would be appropriate, does not distort them, misuse them, try to edit them, which is what typically happens, but to let our words come out, as we've said, with the continuity of our words. If that is the case, including Mr. Johnson, you and your members, and all of the witnesses, we may find a way to come together. And so, in the name of the beloved community, thanking all of you for coming today. I want to thank all of our witnesses for appearing today. Each one's testimony has been recorded into this hearing. And without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witness or additional materials for the record. This hearing is now adjourned.